This time, they did not come to steal and leave. They came to break the safety that made ordinary life possible. What fled through these lanes was not only a family, it was the confidence that settled land could still protect itself. The clash at the edge of the village meant more than violence. A boundary had failed, and with it, a local order. From above, the damage looks less like chaos than interruption. Roads, storage, labor, and shelter are all breaking together. Years earlier, places like Lindisfarne had revealed something important. Wealth sat exposed, and response often came too slowly. Those early coastal strikes may have looked isolated. In reality, they tested distance, access, timing, and the weakness of concentration. The shoreline was not only a target, it was a classroom where raiders learned how England could be entered repeatedly. Men like this were not rushing blindly ashore. They were measuring coastlines, water depth, retreat paths, and inland possibilities. Monasteries held silver, manuscripts, and symbolic authority, but they also revealed how undefended important places could remain in England. The deeper question was changing. How do raiders become an army, and how does an army begin moving like a state? The answer lay partly in geography. England's rivers offered inland passage, and stillness itself concealed a future line of advance. When the map is widened, separate attacks begin to look connected. The coastline becomes a starting point, not the limit. Road access changed the scale of danger. Boats could carry force beyond beaches and place pressure deep inside settled country. Across many regions, local power remained slow, divided, and uncertain. Information arrived faster than any common response could form. This was not simply a failure of courage, it was a failure of coordination across a fragmented political landscape. And behind the visible strikes stood preparation. Food, rope, transport, and timing made repeated movement possible across multiple seasons. Seen together, the pattern no longer suggests opportunistic raiding. It suggests campaign logic, regional sequencing, and expanding operational ambition. To understand what came next, we have to stop imagining a swarm of raiders and start seeing a machine. What formed here was not a raid enlarged, but several warbands converging into one coordinated instrument of sustained pressure. At this scale, preparation mattered as much as courage. Ships, stores, and timing had to be aligned before departure. These men were no longer acting as separate coastal predators. They were being assembled into a campaign force. Violence was becoming directional. Separate ambitions were being arranged into a shared operational design against England. Across the sea, movement itself reveals intention. This was transport organized for continuity, not for one brief strike. Once inside English waters, the danger changed. Force could now move, pause, regroup, and continue beyond the coastline. Order appears even in equipment. Rows of shields suggest storage, preparation, and discipline beyond opportunistic raiding. The landscape remained quiet, but only on its surface. Behind that stillness, a larger machine was taking form. Ivar matters here not as legend, but as a mind inside coordination, where roots, timing, and force had to align. Halfdan appears less as a heroic warrior than as a commander maintaining continuity between movement, command, and occupation. Ubba's role too belongs to administration of violence, where direction, unloading, and discipline mattered more than spectacle. Together, these men helped align separate forces into one campaign logic. Their authority gave violence structure and direction. Leadership was distributed across space. The army's strength depended on linked command, not on a single heroic center. A campaign of this scale required information moving constantly. Messages had to travel faster than confusion or delay. But leadership alone does not conquer kingdoms. Behind these men stood systems that made repeated success materially possible. Once the frame widens, commanders shrink. What matters increasingly is the infrastructure carrying them across distance in season. The real advantage was hidden behind the visible leaders. Crates, roots, animals, and stored tools carried the campaign forward. They did not fight randomly. Grain, fish, rope, repair tools, and spare weapons made repeated inland movement possible. Supply routes linked coasts, rivers, camps, and target zones. Behind every strike stood a structure feeding endurance. Mobility depended on more than ships alone. Horses extended range inland and reduced the friction of distance. Overwintering changed the nature of war. An army that stayed through cold months ceased to behave like raiders. Stored food meant time. Time meant planning, repair, recovery, and the capacity to resume violence without withdrawing home. Information also had to be managed. Traders, scouts, and intermediaries could identify routes, wealth, weakness, and opportunity. Silver did more than reward victory. It linked commerce, tribute, and intelligence inside the same expanding system. Season by season, the pattern becomes clearer. Move, hold, extract, recover, and then press forward again. What remains after passage is often silence. Yet even silence can show that repeated occupation has altered a landscape. River transport reduced cost and delay. Boats turned English waterways into arteries for supplies, men, and sustained pressure. In reality, the greatest advantage was friction reduced. Water, roads, and pack movement were being made to work together. Then the image narrows again. A shield wall appears, and the question changes from strength to response time. For local defenders, the problem was not only fear. They were meeting a system that had already arrived organized. The confrontation itself is almost secondary. More important is the timing and who reached the field prepared. Repeatedly, English mobilization lagged behind established Viking positions. The weakness lay in response speed across divided kingdoms. Inside local halls, information arrived faster than agreement. Regional duties, delay, and fragmentation slowed any common answer. Knowledge existed, but decision did not become movement quickly enough. Administration could see danger without matching its tempo. Sometimes failure is visible as absence. The road remains empty, and the help that should arrive does not. So the deeper puzzle remained unresolved. Why were Anglo-Saxon armies repeatedly late against an enemy already thinking in campaigns? England's rivers changed the scale of war. They turned the interior into an accessible battle space where coast no longer meant safety. Once boats entered these waters, warning time collapsed. Force could travel inland before local power understood where pressure would fall. Mobility was no longer only maritime. Men, supplies, and animals moved together, extending reach beyond the shoreline with practical discipline. Winter should have slowed campaigning. Instead, it revealed that these operations were built for continuation, not seasonal withdrawal. The cold itself became evidence. An army still moving through frozen ground was already thinking beyond the habits of raiding. Overwintering mattered because it changed behavior. An army that stayed, repaired, and stored food was preparing to remain dangerous. Meanwhile, English response still lagged behind movement. Fragmented kingdoms struggled to coordinate against forces already operating through shared tempo. Messages arrived, but agreement moved slowly. Political division turned knowledge of danger into delayed and often local reaction. Administration could see the problem without matching it. Orders hesitated while the operational center kept moving elsewhere. And when speed met an unprepared town, collapse could happen before any wider response had fully formed. Panic spread faster than command. In places like this, ordinary people encountered systemic failure first in streets and marketplaces. A gate was more than timber. It was the visible promise that organized life could still defend itself. Once that promise failed, every civic function failed with it. Trade, shelter, order, and movement collapsed together. For those trapped inside, the disaster was immediate. There was no strategic picture, only narrowing choices and shrinking safety. Sometimes the clearest sign of collapse is absence. A street empties and the old order does not return. But even here, destruction was not the whole story. The force entering the town moved with selective, practical intention. What mattered now was access. Keys, records, and storage points were often more valuable than random damage. This is where the meaning changes. A town begins as a target, then becomes an asset under occupation. Control fixed itself around crossings and towns. Conquest was becoming anchored, administrative, and designed to endure. Granaries were strategic centers. Food under guard meant a population could be pressured and an occupying force sustained. Silver transformed violence into income. Tribute made occupation profitable, repeatable, and easier to maintain across time.
Submission did not always require belief. Often it required calculation when survival depended on complying with altered authority. A garrison changed the meaning of victory. Once men stayed at the gate, capture became durable presence. Local elites could collaborate without admiration. Under pressure, negotiation often became the rational language of survival and leverage. What changed hands was not only grain or storage, it was part of the right to decide how life continued. Extraction networks linked countryside to occupied towns. Violence was being converted into recurring revenue through controlled movement and collection. At crossings like this, the new order became spatially visible. Movement narrowed, watched, and answered to foreign authority. By the 870s, large parts of England no longer operated under older assumptions of rule and response. The change was territorial, but also procedural. Roads, towns, and rivers now served different political logic. Occupation did not end economic life. It redirected exchange under supervision, turning civic space into a managed resource. Even administration was changing form. Record-keeping, force, and local routine were beginning to coexist inside one altered system. Older institutions still survived, but under new conditions. Familiar figures moved through towns no longer governed by familiar assumptions. Somewhere in the south, a different response was beginning. The invasion was forcing England to study its own weakness. Not all land had yet been absorbed. That mattered because untouched ground could still become a site of adaptation. This was not simple replacement of one population by another. It was displacement of how authority worked on the ground. England was no longer facing scattered intrusions. It was living inside an expanding network of reconfigured control. Then the transformation received a line. A boundary began to appear because the new order had stabilized enough to be seen. A frontier is never only symbolic. Once marked in earth, it tells people where authority begins and ends. And once a division enters the landscape, it also enters the mind. Uncertainty becomes part of everyday movement. At such crossings, geography becomes administration. Passage itself now depends on recognition of a different ruling power. This line would come to signify more than occupation. It marked a territory where another system of rule had consolidated. Danelaw was beginning to emerge, not merely as a border, but as proof that conquest had become structure.
Danelaw was becoming more than conquered ground. It was beginning to function as a territorial framework with its own logic of rule. Here, authority no longer appeared only through force. It appeared through assemblies, witnesses, and repeated procedures that people could recognize. Power deepens when it becomes legible. A witnessed agreement can bind daily life more quietly than open violence. Silver mattered because predictability mattered. Exchange becomes political once markets depend on the order imposed by new rulers. Arbitration was not softness, it was conquest, learning how to administer dispute, property, and profit inside occupied space. Commerce stabilizes rule when roads, rivers, and market towns begin working under one enforceable framework. This is why the barbarian stereotype begins to fail. Destruction alone does not produce a functioning market square. For ordinary people, adaptation often began as routine. They moved through a system they did not choose but had to read. Now, law sat beside force, not apart from it. Record-keeping itself had become part of occupation. The major shift was now visible. Danelaw was acting less like a frontier of conquest and more like governance. But integration creates its own danger. The more stable a system becomes, the more clearly it can be opposed. A garrison protects order, yet it also fixes power in place. What can be located can eventually be contested. Administration and violence remained intertwined. Stability did not remove coercion, it merely made coercion more structured and visible. A wall in the rain can look secure. In reality, permanence also means exposure to future resistance. Conquest did not end when people stopped running. It entered houses, meals, and the quieter routines of daily life. Children raised inside such spaces inherit altered assumptions. They grow inside arrangements that older generations would still call foreign. Trade carried more than goods. It carried familiarity, repetition, and the habits through which new rule reproduces itself socially. When settlement, exchange, and household ties spread together, outside force begins to turn into embedded order. Language shifts are often subtle evidence. New names in familiar places begin to coexist under altered authority. Ports and quays made this transformation durable. Goods continued to move, and movement itself normalized the new system. Even intimacy could become historical evidence. Marriage and family ties marked a deeper insertion of power into society. Material culture records this process quietly. Tools, cloth, and household objects show worlds no longer fully separate. By this stage, towns, roads, and crossings were not merely occupied, they were being governed in coordination. Law, tribute, trade, and settlement were not separate stories. Together, they formed a competing political model inside England. Local elites mattered because rule rarely survives on force alone. It also requires accommodation, records, and managed continuity. Here, the system becomes tangible. Commerce, law, and armed supervision collapse into one practical architecture of sovereignty. The invader becomes hardest to remove when ordinary people can see how daily decisions are now being administered. Earlier raids had struck and moved on. This order remained, measured, collected, judged, and connected across territory. The deepest conquest is often quiet. Life continues, but it now continues inside someone else's framework of power. Native institutions did not simply vanish. Many adapted, survived, and operated under terms shaped by foreign authority. That pressure forced learning elsewhere. In the South, some were beginning to study not raids, but systems. Danelaw now stood as more than occupation. It pressed against a surviving order that had not yet been fully absorbed. A frontier makes the transformation visible. One side is ruled through a new embedded logic, and the other must adapt. By now, the old categories no longer fit. These were not outsiders passing through, but rulers becoming normal. This is why the Great Heathen Army matters. It did not only attack England, it helped reorganize what England was. And once such a system holds, the next question changes. Not how to survive invasion, but how to answer it. By now, Danelaw was no longer merely occupied territory. It had become a system pressing outward against what remained outside it. The map narrows because the problem changes. England is no longer facing raids, but a competing order advancing by structure. Yet not all land had been absorbed. That mattered because surviving space could still become a site of adaptation. In the south, some had begun to study the invasion differently. They were reading routes, timing, and exposed corridors. What mattered now was not outrage alone. It was learning how pressure moved through rivers, roads, and delayed decisions. A native response would have to change its shape. Old patterns of reaction were too slow for this kind of war. So preparation began in quieter forms. Repair, storage, and supervision mattered before any larger confrontation could be attempted. Defenses also had to become more deliberate. A crossing strengthened in time could slow a system built on movement. Somewhere within this pressure, one ruler was beginning to understand the problem with unusual clarity and urgency. He matters here not as a hero, but as a mind learning faster than the order pressing against him. The question was whether a surviving kingdom could reorganize before replacement became permanent across the rest of England. Expansion creates overreach. Even successful systems begin to strain when frontiers lengthen and resistance starts to concentrate. What emerged in Wessex was not defiance alone. It was a smaller center trying to become more coherent. Recognition only matters if it becomes action. A sealed order marks the difference between seeing danger and answering it. Earlier roads had often remained empty. Now, movement itself suggests that response time may finally be changing. Survival begins with attention. A kingdom that watches earlier can begin to think earlier and perhaps mobilize sooner. The coming struggle would not be courage against courage. It would be one political military system against another. Civilizations rarely fail all at once. They fail in response time, coordination, and imagination, and sometimes survive by relearning all three.